Hi, I'm Loida Estelita Vera, a student in Professor Robles' Contemporary Latin American Fiction class. At the start of the semester, Professor Robles framed our course as an interrogation of the prolonged state of emergency in Latin America, invoking the nuanced racial, sexual, gender-based, and class-based inequalities that condemn the region to crisis. This state of emergency is in constant flux, exacerbated by the United States' unrelenting intervention across all of Latin America. One such intervention in Chile haunts the streets of Santiago to this day. The US-backed military coup of Augusto Pinochet against the region's first democratically elected Marxist leader, Salvador Allende, terrorized the country with a chilling legacy that prevails today. Under Pinochet's regime, thousands of leftists and political critics were interned, tortured, disappeared, and murdered. The Chilean writer Roberto Bolaño embeds the trauma of Pinochet's reign into his story, Meeting with Enrique Lihn, a short description of a dream Bolaño has where he meets the Chilean poet Enrique Lihn, exploring the violence and terror that lingers in Santiago's streets. In it, Bolaño conjures the memory of the activist and singer Víctor Jara, who was murdered after being tortured during the massacre at Chile Stadium on September 16, 1973. In Meeting with Enrique Lihn, Bolaño employs aspects of infrarealism to interpret the violence, ongoing traumas, and repressed memories of Pinochet's dictatorship as a visceral nightmare that one can't escape. Bolaño's infrarealist movement is characterized by its turbulent, manic, and chilling lyricism. Formed in 1974, when Bolaño moved to Mexico fleeing Pinochet's regime, infrarealism was a response to the gruesome reality of Pinochet's Chile, a nightmarish horror that forced Chilean literature into radical heroism. In Meeting with Enrique Lihn, Bolaño presents infrarealism through a film noir aesthetic, an exploration of the hero in crisis. The brooding tone of the story is underscored through the deteriorated condition of its characters, Bolaño, Lihn, and Jara. Bolaño encounters Lihn as a thinner and younger version of himself, likening him to a B-list actor. Later, however, Bolaño notices that Lihn takes a dense pill every 3 hours to remain as he is, and he realizes that Lihn knows he's dead. Lihn bemoans, quote, "My heart's given up on me. It doesn't exist anymore." Bolaño notes that Lihn died of cancer, not a heart attack. However, Lihn's death in 1988, before Pinochet left power, would have hampered his ambitions for Chilean poetry. Pinochet's persecution of writers and artists forced these communities to endure the torture, disappearances, and murder of their peers collectively. Lihn continues, quote, "The tigers are finished, and it was sweet while it lasted, and you're not going to believe this, Bolaño, but in this neighborhood, only the dead go out for a walk." Víctor Jara is also conceived through the film noir aesthetic. In an encounter with a 50s gangster, Bolaño creates an idealized Jara, imagining, quote, "a world which seemed too wide even for Jara, a world in which even the great Jara was an ant whose death on a shining step would not have mattered at all to anyone." The anxiety of the encounter with the so-called Jara is a jarring moment in Bolaño's story. Jara's significance as a symbol of the working class struggle led to his persecution and death. The tortured body of Jara, riddled with 40 bullets, ingrained a collective trauma into all of Chile. But Bolaño's Jara roams the underworld as just another victim. Jara's ode to Ho Chi Minh and his song El Derecho de Vivir en Paz transcends the borders of Chile by speaking to the poor man's trauma across the world. Quote, "Más allá del ancho mar, donde revientan la flor, con genocidio y la pan, la luna es una explosión que funde todo el clamor." el derecho de vivir en paz. Jara's ardent plea for the right to live in peace evokes Bolaño's infrarealism, a framework of beauty that is conceived in violence. In his infrarealist manifesto, Bolaño writes, "Metan a toda la ciudad al manicomio. Dulce hermana, aullidos de tanque, canciones hermafroditas, desiertos de diamante. Solo viviremos una vez y las visiones cada día más gruesas y resbalosas. Apriétense los cinturones, porque se riegan los cadáveres." Bolaño's description of Santiago's dreadful atmosphere also reveals the effects of the trauma and violence of Pinochet throughout the city. Bolaño describes the, quote, ash blowing about the streets mingled with the filth of Santiago, a horror movie leavened with large doses of black humor. Walking around the city, Bolaño and Lihn are in an existential trance. Quote, "The sidewalks were gray and uneven, and the sky looked like a mirror without a taint. The place where everything should have been reflected, but where in the end, nothing was." In the Infrarealist Manifesto, Bolaño elaborates on the sometimes romantic tone of trauma. Dancing Club de la Miseria, Pepito Tequila sollozando su amor por Lisa underground. Chúpaselo, chúpatelo, chupémoselo. Y el horror. Here, Bolaño references Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, an existentialist novel where the underground man falls in love with a prostitute named Lisa, desperately trying to save her from her fate before realizing the pathetic futility of his desire for her. As imagined in Dostoevsky and Bolaño, the underground is where the invisibilized wander, the working class, the oppressed, the political refugees, all collectively reliving the horror of their fate. Sometimes it is torturous, sometimes it is sensual. Bolaño terms his underground the imaginary city, one that insists on being remembered as a city that once resembled hell. Bolaño's focus on the repressed memories that creep up as one walks through Santiago draws the reader into a remembrance of Pinochet's victims. Bolaño writes, "Looking at the streets and the facades of the buildings, and that peculiar neighborhood where the only people out walking were dead, and we looked, and the facades were clearly the facades of another time, like the sidewalks covered with parked cars, which also belonged to another time. A time that was silent yet mobile. Lihn was watching it move. A terrible time that endured for no reason other than sheer inertia." Bolaño imprisons the Chilean poet into a permanent nightmare, condemning him to an incessant wrestle with death, violence, and the memory of every Chilean lost. In the Infrarealist Manifesto, Bolaño implores, "Que la amnesia nunca nos bese en la boca, que nunca nos bese. Soñábamos con utopía y nos despertamos gritando. Un pobre vaquero solitario que regresa a su casa, que es la maravilla." Meeting with Enrique Lihn voices Bolaño's mourning of Pinochet's victims through a visceral nightmare, endured by each disappeared, tortured, and murdered Chilean. But Bolaño doesn't just mourn Chile. In his words, all of Latin America is identified as a region steeped in crisis. This resonance is similarly felt in the last song Víctor Jara ever wrote. Scribbled into a notepad in the tumult of Chile Stadium, Jara penned these words just before he was dragged to his death. "Canto que mal me sales, cuando tengo que cantar espanto. Espanto como el que vivo, espanto como el que muero, espanto."